Hi everyone. Shall I think we'll start. We have other people who will be joining us, but we don't have a lot of time, and I'm keen to give everyone a chance to speak and participate. So we'll start the seminar. So welcome everyone. I'm Heather Wakefield. I'm a member of the Women's Budget Group, and I've written a few briefings on local government finance. This seminar is called Local Government Finance, Can Equality Impact Assessments Make a Difference? And I guess we all think they should. So we're going to talk about that. We've got four great speakers. We've got Dr. Olumide Adisa and Fiona Costello from the University of Suffolk. We've got Councillor Kalwinder Sandhu, otherwise known as Kindy, I think, who is a councillor on Coventry City Council, and we have Emily Bell from the Women's Budget Group. I think it's a very timely seminar. We have local elections coming up in England on the 6th of May. 145 councils will be holding elections for about 5,000 councillor seats, and that includes all county councils. So the councils responsible for the big things like social care and education and so on. There are also elections for 13 directly elected mayors and for the London Assembly. Women are in a minority when it comes to being councillors, particularly women of colour. So only 35% of councillors are women, and only 7% are Black or ethnic minority councillors. So when it comes to equality impact assessments, that's something important to remember. And equality impact assessments are really important because, as we all know, women are more dependent on local services because of the unequal division of labour within the home and for caring. They're also 3/4 of the local government and school workforce and 90% of care workers. And of course, local authorities have been important funders of voluntary sector projects around domestic violence and other things that women are very dependent on. And there have been massive cuts to local government finance since 2010. About half central government funding has gone. Local authorities have about a quarter less to spend per person than they had, and there's going to be about an 8 million funding gap by 2025, according to the Local Government Association. So this discussion is taking place at a very important time for equality impact assessments and for women. I won't say any more except to say, could you please put questions and answers, could you please raise your hand using the raise hand function rather than put questions and answers in the chat box. Thank you. So I'm going to start off by inviting Dr. Olumide Adisa to speak to us, followed by Fiona Costello.
Thank you very much. I think hopefully, can everyone see our slides okay on the screen? Brilliant. So hi everyone, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today about the research we undertook on the use of equality impact assessments at a local authority level. I'll begin by introducing myself, and then I'll talk about the research, how and why we undertook it, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Olumide to discuss what we actually found. If I could have the first slide there, please. So my name is Fiona Costello. As well as working in research, I've worked in the voluntary sector for the last 10 years, working for charities supporting refugees, asylum seeker and other migrant communities. While the charity I work for is not a women-only service, 60% of our clients are women. So the work that we do is relatively gendered due to sheer client need. In my research, I'm passionate about bridging this frontline knowledge and expertise from charities into academic and policy audiences and outputs. My research interest very broadly is around everyday law, the reach that law has into people's everyday lives and the impact that it has, such as for this instance, you know, the impact of local authority budget decisions on people's everyday lives in their communities. May I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Moving on then to the research, we became interested in this area. Firstly, in undertaking this work, we were influenced and inspired by earlier and ongoing women budget group work. You know, they've undertaken so much work in this area to date. At the time of the research, we were also working on 2 different local authority funded evaluation projects at the University of Suffolk, evaluating women's domestic abuse services. And this got us thinking about policy design at a local authority level and budgetary decision processes and how budget cuts, for example, impact women, especially for us at the time thinking about the domestic abuse services landscape and how analysis of impact is undertaken before decisions are made. Before I talk about what we did, I'll quickly introduce some of the legislative foundations and duties that we are talking about. To set the scene, the 2010 Equality Act, as many of you will know, provides a legal framework to protect the rights of individuals and advance equality of opportunity for all. It lists 9 protected characteristics of age, disability, gender reassignment, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. The Equality Act also contains a public sector equality duty, which very briefly says that all public bodies in England, Scotland and Wales have to have due regard to the impact of their policies on eliminating discrimination and harassment, promoting equality, and fostering good relations through the lens of these 9 protected characteristics I've just listed. For our research, we were primarily interested in the use of equality impact assessments, so our EIAs, which are a tool by which public bodies can evidence that they've met their equality duty. They don't have to use them, but they can provide a means of systematically gathering and analysing evidence on the equality's impact of a decision that they're making, you know, in this instance at a local authority level. May I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So for our research, to gather this information, we undertook a freedom of information request, an FOI, via email to all the local authorities across the UK, and the emails were sent out in January 2019. The FOI replies were collected and analysed between January and October 2019, and out of the then 351 targeted local authorities, 76 did not respond at all, and 275 did. There were 3 kind of very broad information requests contained within our FOI, which I've outlined here in these 3 bullet points on the screen. But crucially, we were interested in equality impact assessments and analysis of proposed changes to the budget, which had taken place, and any evidence or record which local authorities had of this. So I'll now hand you over to my colleague, Olumide, who will talk you through the findings and their implications.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for that very great introduction, and also to Heather as well for that really interesting welcome and introduction. When you said the statistics about 7% of Black and minoritized women are councillors, and I was just really, shocked, because it shouldn't really shock me, but it's one of those things where you see the numbers and you think, there is a lot of work to do. So that was very interesting. Thank you very much. I also want to pay tribute to the Women's Budget Group, because I think without them, Fiona and I have done this work because we, as she rightly said, we were interested in and inspired by a lot of what they had done. But also for me, having come to know Women's Budget Group much more as a policy group member, I think what they're doing is really phenomenal, and it's because of them and the platform that we can actually bring this work and share it with you today. So just to say a huge thank you to the Women's Budget Group, Marianne, and a really amazing team. So just a little bit about me. So I'm the head of Centre for Abuse Research at the University of Suffolk, and I look after our domestic abuse research portfolio. And I'm a cross-disciplinary researcher, so I'm a trained economist. I did an interdisciplinary PhD looking at combining economics and sociology. And then I've also dabbled into sociolegal work, looking at access to justice. So I am what you might call a cross-disciplinary researcher. And what that means is I'm very much a very pragmatic researcher, in the sense that I think that there is a role for research, but there's also a role for research influencing practice, and vice versa as well. So at the University of Suffolk and the Centre for Abuse Research specifically, we're very interested in assessing what works for tackling domestic abuse. And as Fiona has already said, a lot of our projects actually are funded by local authorities, voluntary sector organizations, and pretty much external commissions. So a lot of issues, so the questions around money and the flow of money and budget cuts is something that very much is at the forefront of some of the decisions that we kind of become closer to. And so it raised a lot of interesting questions for us. I do tweet a lot, so if you wanted to follow me, that's my Twitter hashtag @Adisa. And if you see, that's a link to find out more about my work. Next slide, please, Tafisa. Thank you. So just building on what Fiona said in terms of what we found out, obviously we sent the FOI to about 351 local authorities, and only 87 actually had carried out equality impact assessments, and actually, only 87 had obviously given due regard. Now, it might not surprise if for those that maybe might be very close to local government, but it was very surprising for us because, obviously we knew that equality impact assessment is not a statutory requirement. However, given the sort of very important decisions that are being made around services for women and protected characteristics, we actually thought we would have a higher figure than that. So one of the things, when we got all of the FOIs and we actually looked at who was obviously doing what, one of the things we found was that unitary authorities, London Borough Councils and metropolitan boroughs were actually more likely to undertake equality impact assessments in their budget setting procedures as against district and county councils. Now that was very interesting for us to see that, because we thought, oh, what's going on here? Is it a capacity issue? And I will come back and touch on that point in a minute as well. Tafisa, next slide, please. Thank you very much. So this is literally what we found in a nutshell, to just summarize. So for 47, there was an incidence of 47% for a lot of boroughs, as I said, actually doing EIAs as a matter of practice. And obviously, as you walk your way down the table, you can actually see that is obviously less likely for you to find an EIA within county councils and district councils, at least on the basis of that FOI that we undertook. So that was very interesting in that sense, in terms of that finding, because we did give us pause to think about, oh, what's going on here? Why is there a differing appetite in actually doing equality impact assessments? Next slide, please. So some of the other findings we found was that actually when we looked at those equality impact assessments that were sent to us as part of the EIAs, as part of the FOI rather, a lot of them touched very lightly on gender impacts. Sex was as a protected characteristic under the Equality Act, rarely featured even significantly within the decision impact assessments, based on the documentation we saw. Also, one of the things we found out was that even though there were so many implications for the disposable income of individuals and households in those communities, we couldn't really track and link it back to the degree to which they had given due regard to equalities when those proposed changes were being made to the budgets. And also, lastly, we found out that a few of the local authorities that said they had not done any EIAs. So if you imagine not in the 87 group, but they discussed that. They did discuss it in the minutes of the meeting in a way, but that was just about it, really. And I think that was very surprising for us, in the sense that we expected some more robust analysis around the impacts of budgetary decision making. Next slide, please. Right. So before I come to the why is that the work and our work in particular important, but even generally the work that Women's Budget Group have been doing on EIA is actually also important. I think it's very important to kind of talk about the implications of the findings. The first is that if it's a capacity issue, as we said, what does that then mean for the policy impacts, and what does that mean for local authorities who actually have to make these decisions on a daily basis, and what does that actually mean for giving due regard under the public sector equality duty? So these are questions that obviously, when we look at the findings, it does give you pause to say, these are really pertinent questions to ask. One of the things that also stood out for us as well is that, there is perhaps a space for us to encourage local authorities to obviously undertake equality impact assessments in their practice. But then there is a question of what makes a good EIA, equality impact assessment for short. What makes a good EIA? Well, how do we begin to actually, what role do they play? And I think some of the discussions we're going to be having today would probably address some of that. And in our briefing, which was obviously published today, there's a really interesting case study from UNISON as well, which actually shows the role that an EIA can play. So I think there is we shouldn't underestimate the power of equality impact assessments, because at the minimum, at least it helps to raise those questions around, who is going to be most affected by a particular budgetary decision. For us, actually, for giving our very close link to domestic abuse services, we're seeing a worrying trend of cuts to services. We're seeing where services are being lost, and there's nothing replacing that. And I think the questions around impact assessments, equality impact assessments being done, become even much more pertinent, because given the scale and the cost of domestic abuse, we really should be worried about that, in a sense that if cuts can be made, the services that are vital for women in communities who are actually trying to flee the abuser or trying to actually rebuild their lives, then they can't do that. So this is a very important, that's just one example. We can also look at the impact in relation to disabled people as well, and I think there's a lot to be said around, even though we're focusing on women, it's very important not to forget about the intersectionality of some of these issues. So one of the things we found, as I said, we looked at, did they even at a minimum mention sex as a protected characteristic? One of the things, and touching on obviously the very lovely and interesting welcome that Heather said, is that actually women of color are less likely to be in positions of power, right, at local level. So it becomes even more important when we're looking at actually when women are in the minority to also ask which women as well. So I'm just going to talk on about that slide. So Tafisa, so if we can break that up again, in terms of why this work is important. First, as I said, it's very important to say that our findings, obviously, even though they were very surprising, they've been corroborated by other studies as well. We're very inspired by the Women's Budget Group, but also there's been this really interesting study that was also done looking at the aims and effectiveness of public sector equality duty, which was done by Marianne actually in 2016. So it's what I read. And some of the themes and some of the findings that she found in our own study were very similar to what we were finding, that actually it's a bit depressing, because imagine we did this in 2019 I think that's probably my time. So I've got 1 more minute to go on that. I try to keep an eye on time, otherwise I'm going to keep talking about it. So apologies for that. Can I just have the previous slide, Tavisa? Sorry, I'm just going to quickly go through that one, because it's very important to just end on something that, even though we kind of looked at equality impact assessments as something that is not a statutory requirement, I think that there is still a lot of mileage that it can actually, the role it can play within this system and within not just only local authorities, but also at the national level. I also think that, for us, there are obviously certain considerations we have to keep in mind in terms of how can we have a successful implementation of EIAs, and hopefully maybe with the Q&As as well, we can touch on some of those issues. But also we did make recommendations in our briefings in terms of actually what we think needs to improve the situation. So we didn't just find findings and then, which obviously might seem a little bit depressing, but at the same time, we did actually give recommendations, for instance, in terms of how we can begin to improve it, because we think that if it's a capacity issue, which is why local county councils and district councils are not able to do EIAs properly or are not even doing it at all, that there is a role then to say, what can we do to actually fix the system? What can we do to actually provide a credible solution? And then also, what can we begin to do to begin to mainstream equality champions, for instance, within the system, in order to ensure that this is something that is being done as a norm? And on that note, I'm going to leave it there, really. And yeah, over to you, Heather. I think I may have run by 2 minutes. So sorry about that.
That's quite all right. We started a little bit late. Thank you very much, Fiona and Olumide, for that really great introduction and raising some important questions. We're now going to move on to Councillor Kindi Sandhu from Coventry City Council to give us a perspective from local government. So over to you, Kindi. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully that will work. Just a sec. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you to Women's Budget Group for inviting me today. It's always an honour to attend an event by Women's Budget Group. Even yesterday I was having a conversation where somebody mentioned the Women's Budget Group and the great work that you do. So yes, I'm Kindy Sandhu. I'm a councillor at Coventry City Council. I'm also a postdoc research fellow at Coventry University. And one of the major research projects I'm looking at the moment is the Windrush scandal. My position as a councillor in the council is that I'm head of scrutiny board, which looks at children's services and education. So, okay, so today I've been asked to basically give a brief summary of a report that's called Layers of Inequality, which looked at the cuts and how they particularly affected minoritised women, and also be talking a bit about my experiences as a councillor regarding policy making and equality impact assessments. So this is the title of the report that Mary and myself authored a few years ago. I think it was back in 2014. And we had 4 partners with us. This was the first intersectional report that we were aware of that looked at the impact of the spending cuts on BME women in Coventry. Incidentally, I'm going to use BME because that was the term we used in the report. We looked at 9 areas: the labour market, housing, welfare reform, education, violence against women and girls, health, social care, legal advice services and voluntary organisations. So clearly that's a lot of areas, but I'll only go through a couple of those today for time reasons. So I just wanted to start with a bit of context really about us as BME minoritised women, if you like. So in Coventry, we have 3 wards, Radford, Fossil and St Michael's, which have between them 58% to 60% children living in poverty. And that's even before we know the statistics as a result of the impact of COVID-19. And these are our poorest wards in Coventry, and they're also the wards with the highest concentration of minority ethnic communities. In terms of our health, well, this is the one statistic I'm going to give, and it's Black women are 5 times more likely and Asian women 2 times more likely to die in childbirth and pregnancy than white women. So that's just a couple of statistics which really sets the context of the disproportionate impact on BME women across our lives in many areas of services. So I thought I'd show this diagram. At the time when the changes were being made to the welfare reform, it took me a long time to understand exactly what was going on. Now, there were 22 benefits at the time, and this set diagram that I produced was really to get an understanding at that time which of those benefits were part of the benefits cap, which were part of universal credit, and which were part of both, and which were not in either of those. And so if you're a single parent, if you're somebody who's experiencing mental health issues, if you're worried about getting food on your table for kids, then you're not going to have the headspace, time, etc. to understand this, the complex situation of how the benefits changed at that time and over a period of years. So I'm going to give a statistic of the benefit cap. So what I did was I managed to find the DWP's own impact assessment. Now, the statistics I'm going to give during the presentation are statistics that we came up at that time. And I think what I'd like to say is that although they may not be, the data itself may have changed, I think the important thing and the important message here is how disproportionately BME women and disabled women are being impacted still by not only austerity but COVID too now. And so most of the households affected by the policy, and again, let me emphasise, this was the DWP's own impact assessment. What they said was that those households going to be affected by the benefit cap would have children, and half of those will be lone parents. And we know from research that families with African, Caribbean or Black British mothers are more likely to be families as lone parents than those with a white mother. And in particular, also ethnic minority families tend to be larger. So this led the DWP to conclude this. I couldn't find any data that broke down by gender ethnicity, but certainly from that final statistic, we can conclude how BME families were being disproportionately affected by the benefit cap. And at that time, the benefit cap was 25,000. So another example I'm going to give is talk about the work programme. Often we don't consider government organisations and how they're there to support us as members of society. So this was about the work programme helping women to get back into work. So this is about Coventry. This was statistics that I found over a 15-month period. So I'll just let the data say for itself. So over that 15-month period, if you were a woman from another ethnic group that weren't Asian or white, you were not going to find a job, or they were not successful in helping you find a job under the work programme, certainly in Coventry. So I've shown this quote too, because we often consider the impact of austerity, budget cuts, etc., in terms of money. This shows how the impact is on us as women and girls, as impact on our society. This was a particularly crushing for me, and it was one of the lowest moments I found myself to be in the research, but it does show how we pay the price for not educating girls. And what was interesting about the woman who said this in the quote was that even though one woman said it in the quote, there were other women in the focus group who nodded in agreement. So what's that saying for the future generations? Okay, I'm also going to talk about the legacy of funding of BME voluntary organisations. This is how much funding we get at that time. So this is to give an understanding of another barrier of the context of a legacy of underfunding for BME organisations, and certainly we know the impact on BME women's refugees who are disproportionately impacted by austerity. So that's kind of the conclusion, if you like, of that particular report, Layers of Inequality. I'm now going to move on to what we do at Coventry City Council. So the first thing to say really is that Coventry Council recognises the importance of undertaking equality impact assessments, and we have processes in place to carry out these equality impact assessments, but not only to carry them out, but also to show the importance, to show that how equality data relating to a policy has to be used to understand the potential impact of that policy on protected groups. So this is what we do. So we look at, we do undertake equality impact assessments when we're developing and reviewing policies and guidelines, etc. in these instances. I'd also like to say that part of what we do within the council is also look at existing inequalities. So what have been the inequalities over the years, and whether the proposed changes that we're hoping to make have a positive or negative impact on that. And I think, and that's particularly important in light of the disparities for particular groups under the COVID pandemic. So in the council, there were two things that we were committed to doing, and that was evaluating impact on staff returning to work. So that was a workforce equality impact assessment, but also identifying the potential impacts on key protected groups. And like every other research and other data, we were no different in finding that Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups and people with disabilities have been most disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So, you know, we haven't got everything right. There's still more to do. In fact, I was thinking of having a bullet point on here that said bring Mary Ann in, and maybe that's something I'm hoping that we still will do. And it was interesting, the comments around the number, not only the number of minoritized councillors, women who are councillors, but also the positions that we hold. And you know, and we've recognised that. So, for example, my experience as chair of scrutiny board, I've seen reports that come to me, and there's always a section on equality impact assessment, and some of those are good, and some of those, I guess, are minimal. And so, what we've raised, and I've certainly raised this, is that the need that for those staff who sit outside of the diversity portfolio section of our council is actually I think they require more training to undertake appropriate and higher quality impact assessments. And also, indeed, I would include other chairs of scrutiny boards to be able to identify and understand and ask questions to make sure that the equality impact section of the documents that we scrutinise have the appropriate equality impacts done. I think it also, I've put strong leadership here, I'd like to say that our Deputy Chief Exec, Gail, she is really committed to this, and actually is always keen to take forward and make sure that we do equality impact assessments again. But she's one in amongst, you know, thousands within the council. But however, it does lead me to say that I am keen that we have a cabinet member who's responsible for finances, and I am keen that, and I have spoken to him about this, is that we really do a gendered analysis of our budget to understand where the money's going and who's benefiting, and how proportionately. And maybe I'm hoping that Mary Ann will, I will be able to invite Mary Ann to come and speak to Richard. So that concludes my presentation. There's just my contact details if anybody wants to get in touch with me for further details. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you very much, Kindy. It's great to hear of a local authority that's really taking positive steps around equality impact assessments. Anyway, we're going to move on now to Emily Bell from the Women's Budget Group, who's going to tell us about the local data project and work that WBG is doing. Over to you, Emily.
Thank you, Heather. And I just want to say thank you to Tafisa as well for organising the webinar today and for managing the tech to make sure that it all goes according to plan. My name is Emily Bell, and I am the local training and partnership coordinator for the UK Women's Budget Group. And I'd like to talk to you today about how you can use local data to have an impact in equality impact assessments that are done in your local area. So as Fiona said earlier, the Equality Act in 2010 brought together legislation from different acts, and the aim was to make the law stronger and more streamlined, and it also gave us the public sector equality duty. And the aim of that was to shift the focus of responsibility. So we can move from a reactive position to a more proactive one. This move to a positive approach was in order to not just react when inequality was discovered or experienced, but to proactively promote equality across public bodies and across organisations that provide public services. So again, as Heather mentioned, as Fiona mentioned earlier, this public sector equality duty means that public bodies, and in this case I'm going to talk mostly about local authorities, but it does also apply to other organisations as well, should have due regard to promoting good relations, to advancing equality of opportunity for people who fall under the protected characteristics of the Equality Act, and working towards eliminating discrimination. All of these positive, proactive. So local authorities, one way that they can do this is through equality impact assessments, which, as has been mentioned before, are not a legal requirement, but they are a logical tool to be able to prove that this due regard has been taken. So it might be helpful to consider what an equality impact assessment cycle looks like. And with thanks to Devon County Council for inspiring this slide. They had a very nice simple breakdown of what they do in terms of equality impact assessments. So you can see the different stages. Here I've started with gathering data and then going on to consult with groups who may be affected by policy decisions. You would then want to go on and analyse that data and assess risk in terms of taking this policy, putting this policy into practice. All of this should be done before you make recommendations and then decide on whether you put this policy into practice. Now, this is about policy, but you could equally just swap out the word policy and put the word budget, which would match what the previous speakers were talking about, Dr. Adisa and Fiona Costello. So I would agree with them that it is very important to carry out equality impact assessments on the budget process. And note that at the decision stage, that doesn't mean that the process ends, because you would then want to review the budget or the policy decision, and you would want to start again at that gathering data stage. However, if equality impact assessments are only done at the budget stage, wouldn't that mean that policy decisions have already been made? And what evidence do we have that due regard to promoting equality was taken at the policy stage? Has that been evidenced? So has the public sector equality duty really done what it was supposed to do in terms of moving from proactive to reactive? Unfortunately, as Heather mentioned in the introduction, there have been massive budget cuts at the local level. So whilst this change in legislation came about, it came about at the same time as these massive budget cuts. So the Equality and Human Rights Commission had their budget slashed. The equality departments in councils followed suit. So you may find that departments may be made up of just one person, for example, nowadays. And equalities officers may find themselves in low-grade jobs, meaning that they're less likely to be able to challenge decisions by people who are taking those decisions at higher grade jobs. So, as the research has shown today, it could also be that equality impact assessments are actually missing. Or if they are being done, they might be based on justifying decisions after the fact, rather than really considering the impact in that proactive way, which was the aim of the change in the public sector equality duty. So we would argue that this is a really good reason to encourage local organisations to carry out their own equality impact assessments, which brings me on to the local data project. How can the local data project help organisations to carry out their own equality impact assessments? Well, the aim of the programme is to provide organisations with the tools to access data. There is a lot of data that is available publicly, but it can be difficult to find. So we want to provide organisations and individuals with the tools they need to be able to find the relevant data. We want to help them to learn how to analyse that data and then use it so that they can actually have an impact in that cycle that policymakers go through when they're coming to decisions. If we remember that cycle, it wasn't just about data, whether that's numbers or stories, but it's also in consulting with affected groups. And the local data project would provide both by giving organisations the tools to be able to work with numbers and stories. Hopefully they would be able to influence that policymaker or budget decision maker in both aspects, not just with numbers, but also with stories from relevant groups. So until the Equality and Human Rights Commission has increased powers and budget, the duties under the public sector equality duty they have limited effect. So we are encouraging local organisations to hold public bodies to account. By having the numbers and stories, it's possible to campaign for equality impact assessments to be taken seriously and for equality issues to be considered. Dr. Adisa's comment earlier reminded me of a conversation I had recently with a local council officer. She was talking about focus groups, and when we were having our conversation, it suddenly came to her that none of the focus groups that they talked to was a women's group. So by having that conversation, hopefully the path has been changed, the path has been paved for a change to happen. But it is really striking that an entire group was omitted from the impact assessment data gathering stage, focus group stage. And just to mention that the local data project is more than just about equality impact assessments. We also want to help local groups or organisations or individuals to be able to access and use this data in their own campaigning and advocacy, and also in fundraising as well. So if you are interested in getting more information, you can find out more on the Women's Budget website, wbg.org.uk/LDP. Or if you're interested in joining the training that we will be rolling out very soon, then please email me. My address is there.
Thanks so much, Emily, and thanks again to all our speakers. So we have about 15 minutes for you to ask questions and make contributions. There have been some interesting issues raised. Why are county councils much worse than metropolitan district councils in doing equality impact assessments? I have some ideas about that. And I guess importantly, what can we do to get local authorities to do proper equality impact assessments and follow them through? But over to you. If you could use the raise hand function, if you'd like to speak, that would be great. Or perhaps I'll just kick off by saying that I think the difference between county councils and Met district councils and unitaries is something to do with political complexion, but also to do with the fact that it was kind of urban local authorities that tended to have the equality units and the equality officers, many of whom, as we've heard, are now gone, tended to be more Labour, whereas all but 2 county councils are Conservative councils and more likely to cover rural areas. So I think there are some interesting issues in there that people might like to comment on. Perhaps one of our panelists would like to, Olumide or Fiona?
Yeah, I'm going to say, just make a comment around that, because obviously we did say that one of the things we thought might be happening is a capacity issue. But obviously we do recognize that our study is almost what you might call a conversation starter, in a sense that we think that there is room for a larger study to look at it qualitatively, because you need to look at each area to see what's really going on in that particular local authority. So hopefully those on the call might be inspired to want to do more research in this area, but we do encourage you really greatly that they are interesting questions, because it might not just only be about the fact that there's been loss of equality officers from jobs and things like that, but we know that some research does show that there is a sort of correlation between having equality champions within a particular setting and how they might push forward equality objectives. However, we do know that it's also not a magic bullet. There are structural reasons why sometimes decisions are being made without any due regard being given to equality concerns. So I think that we would probably say that there is room to investigate more, to understand what's really happening on ground. But at the same time, I also think that there is also room for this to not be seen as something that only those within local government or local authority have a responsibility to do. And one of the things I like about what the Women's Budget Group have done, I think they published a guide, I think I saw it in the chat function, is actually how community members and the members of the public can actually hold their the councillors to account, hold local authorities to account, ask those questions around whether or not an equality impact assessment has been undertaken for any particular decision, whether or not it's cutting bus services, to actually deciding to cut a service like a domestic abuse service, for instance, or trying to make it generic. All of this stuff that do have implications for protected characteristics. So I think what I guess I'm saying here is that there is something to be said about that. There is a collective responsibility in there to kind of ensure that this is something that's been done as a matter of policy.
Yeah, thank you, Olumide. We do have a few questions in the question and answer box. So Alex Paling is asking if there's a degree, if the equality impact assessments aren't being carried out, how can central government possibly evaluate where they're at for SDGs? Alex, do you want to say any more about that? Emma M is asking if there are any other stories to share around how equality impact assessments have had a tangible impact on inequalities in any of your areas.
I think I could take the second one. I would probably, because of time, I think the briefing does have a case study from UNISON, which actually breaks down a story of how an equality impact assessment decision has been used really effectively. It's a very interesting one because it actually shows how UNISON challenged the decision that was made in relation to actually budgetary decisions. I think the second one around the link to SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, I would let Emily answer, because I feel like there is something to be said about, there's a link to the local data project there, because I think that there is something to be said about linking local objectives to not just national objectives, but our commitments to international equality objectives as well.
Thank you, Olumide. I've got a question here from an anonymous attendee who says, are you aware of software to record and share equality impact assessments? Will the local data project include this? And are you aware of organisations publishing draft equality impact assessments and working with communities to understand if their assessment is correct or how a proposal could be improved? Maybe Kindy, would you have a view on that? Or any of our speakers, indeed.
I don't really have much insight into the actual data project by Women's Budget Group.
No.
Suffice to say that when Marianne and I did the layers of inequality, we did do a small workshop for increasing capability, if you like, of how to access these big data sets for fundraising purposes. And so it's good to hear that this data project is really setting off, and I think it's a really important area to do. And I think I'm not aware of any specific software. The officers at the council haven't mentioned that, but I guess I think for me it really is about asking those pertinent questions around, so for example, in Coventry, because of the budget cuts, we have had to make some tough decisions around libraries. So one of the questions I've asked is that now that the libraries some of the libraries are in community kind of responsibility, who are the members of the community that are running the libraries on a day-to-day, are doing the strategic work, are doing the finances, are doing the social media, and so the equality impact assessment for me is also about what's happening not only as a consequence of the budgets in the council, but what's happening as a consequence of the decisions made in the council, where local communities are now taking on that responsibility. And I'd just like to add something else about Olumide mentioned about communities holding councils to account. And that's a really important point. The challenge I always face as a councillor is how to get the communities involved, how to get them. So for example, all of our meetings are now live streamed, etc., and we get about a handful of people coming along, attending, etc. So that's a real challenge as well, is the engagement. And my particular feeling around that is that people's lives are really hard, especially for a city like Coventry, where we have exponential growth of food banks, etc., where we can't provide the services that we'd like to. And I think people, even the Director of Children's Services said to me the other day, for many families in our city, the pandemic is not their first priority. It's getting food on the table for the kids.
Okay, thank you very much, Kindy. Someone has asked a question here, which I think is for Fiona. Did you look at the percentage of women on a council and whether there's a correlation with equality impact assessments occurring?
Thank you. I think, as Olumide said, this was kind of a kind of pilot exploratory study that we kind of looked very basically at whether or not EIAs were happening and what evidence there was. But I think, and on the back of this conversation today, there's so much further it could go. So we didn't look actually at number of women or political party, and I think that they would offer some really interesting insights. Maybe if this work is taken forward in the future, I think that certainly it's worth collating all of these conversations and questions today and looking at that deeper level of study of the data that's there. Definitely. I'm sorry we didn't, but we didn't, I'm afraid.
Emily, yes, please do come in. There's a question about whether the local data project will have a database on equality impact assessments and so on.
Yeah, I would just wanted to follow up on what Fiona was saying as well. In my off the record conversations, not with Devon County Council, just so I don't get them in trouble. I asked a question about how many women are involved in this decision-making process with different people, and it didn't. I mean, this is not rigorous research. It didn't seem to have much impact on what was happening. But I think the issues around intersectional voices being present at all stages is such an essential one. So it isn't just the same people making the decisions, but that different groups are brought in. And there are some councils that do cumulative impact assessments, and they go back and they revise their impact assessments by going back to focus groups, a question from earlier, going back and asking focus groups and then reviewing those decisions that had been made to see if they had the impact that they thought they would. Unfortunately, the number of councils doing that seems to be incredibly small, and they're just the councils where there is somebody on the staff who they still have somebody on staff who is in that role of equality officer, because there may be, like I said before, budgets have been cut and departments have been decimated, and they have a real belief in equality impact assessments. I think one of the key issues is that as long as they are seen as a bureaucratic exercise, there won't be change. We have to address the idea that they are an imposition rather than a real tool for helping the communities and actually saving money, because if you get it right in the first place, it will save money. Sorry, I can see Kindy wants to come in, so
yes, we've only got 2 minutes left, I'm afraid, so a very short contribution, Kindy, I'm sorry.
I think, yeah, I absolutely agree with what Emily's saying. And I think the equality impact assessment isn't just at the impact assessment, it's also when you're reviewing strategy or determining strategy. So, for example, violence against young people, gang violence, so-called gang violence, nobody had looked at women's experiences within that, you know, as part of, and it's things like that. And I think it is, for me, it isn't just the number of women, it's women who are open to understanding about intersectionality, understanding why we have these impact assessments, and so that's a challenge as well, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I'm afraid we're drawing to an end. The seminars raised lots of interesting questions, and hopefully the Women's Budget Group can organise another one to perhaps follow up. But I'd like to thank you all for coming, first of all. Certainly to thank all our brilliant speakers, and to Tawfiza for organising the seminar and for the really interesting questions that you've raised. I'm sorry if we've run out of time and there are some that haven't been answered, but please do keep in touch with Women's Budget Group and of course our speakers, and let Emily know. The local data project will be very much engaging with equality impact assessment. So do let Emily know of any interesting news. So have a very good weekend, bank holiday weekend, everyone. And thanks again for coming. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.